The 613 Commandments, Part 7. This Bible study will examine a sample of Torah commandments to see how they would apply to Christians today. We will be using a list of 613 commandments developed by Maimonides and other rabbis as we study the original context of these laws in ancient Israel and consider their connection to the New Testament. We will also correct certain Jewish misinterpretations along the way. In this video, we will cover Leviticus chapters 16 through 18. You can find the 613 Commandments Summary PDF file at the Didactic Ministries website. Commandment 183, Priests approach the ark only on Yom Kippur. Leviticus chapter 16 verse 1 says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they had approached the presence of the Lord and died. The Lord said to Moses, 'Tell your brother Aaron that he shall not enter at any time into the holy place inside the veil, before the mercy seat which is on the ark, or he will die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat.'" This command applies to the high priest of Israel. Since there is no temple in existence today, this particular command is in abeyance. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 7 says, "But only the high priest ever entered the most holy place, and only once a year, and he always offered blood for his own sins, and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance." The Holy of Holies was off limits to everyone except the high priest on the Day of Atonement. This may be the reason that God killed Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu. Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, says that Nadab and Abihu offered incense before the Lord, but God killed them because they didn't follow his regulations for offering incense. God is deadly serious about obedience to his commandments, and he expects the leaders of the congregation to set an excellent example for the people. Commandment 184, Offerings for Yom Kippur. Leviticus chapter 16 verse 3 says, "Aaron shall enter the holy place with this, with a bull for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen tunic, and the linen undergarments shall be next to his body, and he shall be girded with the linen sash, and attired with the linen turban. These are holy garments. Then he shall bathe his body in water and put them on. He shall take from the congregation of the sons of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering." This set of commands applies specifically to the high priest of Israel. Since there is no temple in existence today, these commands are in abeyance. The rituals that the high priest performed on the day of Yom Kippur symbolize the ministry of Jesus Christ, our high priest, who atones for our sins. Hebrews chapter 9 verse 11 says, "But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing eternal redemption." So Yom Kippur was a prophecy of what Christ would do when he came the first time. Commandment 185, All sacrifices must be made at the Lord's altar. Leviticus chapter 17 verse 3 says, "Any Israelite who sacrifices an ox, a lamb, or a goat in the camp or outside of it, instead of bringing it to the entrance to the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, that person shall be considered guilty of bloodshed. They have shed blood and must be cut off from their people." This particular command applies to everyone. Leviticus chapter 17 verse 8 says, "And you shall say to them, any one of the house of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from his people." Since there is no temple in existence today, this command is currently in abeyance. However, when Jesus Christ returns and establishes the millennial temple, Israelites and Gentiles will sacrifice their peace offerings at the Lord's altar on God's Sabbaths and holy days. Commandment 186, hunters must cover animal blood with earth. Leviticus chapter 17 verse 13 says, "So when any man from the sons of Israel or from the aliens who sojourn among them, in hunting catches a beast or a bird which may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. For as for the life of all flesh, its blood is identified with its life. Therefore I said to the sons of Israel, you are not to eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood, and whoever eats it shall be cut off." We see that this is a universal moral command that applied to Israelites and resident aliens alike. God forbids the eating of blood, so he requires everyone to pour the blood on the ground and cover it with earth. Moses repeated this commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 12 verse 16, which says, "You must not eat the blood. Pour it on the ground like water." So God expects all people to drain the blood out of an animal when they kill it, and then cover the blood with earth. Commandment 187, no sexual relations with any family member. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 6 says, "None of you shall approach any blood relative of his to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord." This is a universal moral command that is repeated throughout the Old and New Testament. For example, Leviticus chapter 18 verse 26 says, "But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you." Also, in Colossians chapter 3 verse 5, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry." In this passage, the Apostle Paul taught Jewish and Gentile Christians to avoid sexual immorality, and Leviticus chapter 18 clearly and explicitly defines what sexual immorality is. The phrase, "to uncover nakedness," is a Hebraic euphemism for sexual relations. Thus, God forbids incest with a close relative. The rest of Leviticus chapter 18 is very clear, so we won't spend a great deal of time on each commandment. Commandment 188, no sexual relations with your father. Commandment 189, no sexual relations with your mother. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 7 says, "The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness." This is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Even though Moses used masculine pronouns in this verse, the concept is that a man is not to have sexual relations with his mother, and a woman is not to have sexual relations with her father. Commandment 190, no sexual relations with your stepmother. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 8 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness." This is also a universal moral command that applies to everyone. In fact, the Apostle Paul cited this command in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1, where he wrote, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans, for a man has his father's wife. Here, the Apostle Paul taught Jewish and Gentile Christians that this is a sin. Commandment 191, no sexual relations with your sister. Leviticus 18 verse 9 says, the nakedness of your sister, either your father's daughter or your mother's daughter, whether born at home or born outside, their nakedness you shall not uncover. This is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. God did not give this commandment at the beginning when He created Adam and Eve, since their children were only able to marry close relatives. However, after the population of the earth increased, He gave this law to His people. For example, Genesis chapter 20 verse 12 says that Sarai was Abraham's half-sister. She was his father's daughter, and she was also Abraham's wife. But God didn't object at that time. Commandment 192, no sexual relations with your daughter. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 17 says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter. This is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Commandment 193, no sexual relations with your son's daughter. Commandment 194, no sexual relations with your daughter's daughter. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 10 says, the nakedness of your son's daughter, or your daughter's daughter, their nakedness you shall not uncover, for their nakedness is yours. In other words, they are close relatives, and no one is to have sexual relations with a close relative, so this is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Commandment 195, no sexual relations with your stepsister. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 11 says, the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, born to your father, she is your sister. You shall not uncover her nakedness. This again is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Commandment 196, no sexual relations with your paternal aunt. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 12 says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's blood relative. Commandment 197, no sexual relations with your maternal aunt. Leviticus 18 verse 13 says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's blood relative. Commandment 198, no sexual relations with your uncle. Commandment 199, no sexual relations with your paternal uncle's wife. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 14 says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. You shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt. This is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Commandment 200, no sexual relations with your son's wife. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 15 says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. This is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Commandment number 201, no sexual relations with your brother's wife. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 16 says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. Although this is a universal moral command, it only applied while the brother was still alive. The Bible makes clear in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, that if a man died without a male heir, his younger brother was to perform the duty of a levirate marriage and provide her with a male heir who would take care of her in her old age. Commandment number 202, no sexual relations with a stepdaughter. Commandment 203, no sexual relations with a stepson's daughter. Commandment 204, no sexual relations with a stepdaughter's daughter. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 17 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter, nor shall you take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are blood relatives. It is lewdness." We see here that this is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Commandment number 205, you shall not marry your wife's sister. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 18 says, "You shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a rival while she is alive, to uncover her nakedness." This again is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. Commandment 206, no sexual relations during menstrual impurity. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 19 says, "Also you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness during her menstrual impurity." This is a universal moral command that is repeated throughout the Old and New Testament. For example, in Galatians chapter 5 verse 19, Paul wrote, "Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness." In this passage, Paul is discussing uncleanness in the context of human sexuality, which is certainly related to Leviticus chapter 18, verse 19. Commandment 207, don't offer your offspring to Molech. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21 says, "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." This is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. The ancient Canaanites worshipped the false god Molech with child sacrifice. God condemns idolatry and child sacrifice throughout the Bible. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, the Apostle Paul said that idolaters will not inherit the kingdom of God, which would include the idolatrous worship of Molech. Commandment 208, no sexual relations between men. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22 says, "You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination." This is a universal moral command that is repeated throughout the Old and New Testament. God condemned this practice in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 26, and 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. God gave Israel his commandments so that they would have long and healthy lives. Ancient peoples did not understand the concept of bacteria and viruses, but now we know that sexual perversion and promiscuity accelerate the spread of sexually transmissible diseases through a community. So God's wisdom is self-evident to us today. Commandment number 209, no bestiality by men. Commandment number 210, no bestiality by women. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 23 says, "Also, you shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion." This is a universal moral command that applies to everyone. God gave Israel his commandments so that they would have long and healthy lives. Ancient peoples did not understand the concept of bacteria and viruses, but now we know that sexual perversion and promiscuity accelerate the spread of sexually transmissible diseases through a community. So God's wisdom is self-evident to us today.